Okay, Elena will be here in a moment. I wanted to do a brief conversation about the context of this course and where it fits with the rest of the material. So we're doing that first year stuff right now and we're recording it, and that's a lot of this cherry picking of essays. The second year is a lot more of this narrative, chronological storytelling thing that I'm going to be providing like 12 lenses through which to approach the the conversation of Western philosophy as if it's an ongoing story. And in that, there's a lot of cycles and things that repeat. And there's clearly some philosophers that we look at who are aware of that. Well, Nietzsche was one of those. And when we're looking at Jordan Peterson, he's been bringing up Nietzsche already. And we're looking at him in that context. So, our backbone course for year three is Decoding Zarathustra, which we went through Twitter last year, and we're going to do again at some point here. Um, it's like maybe the most purposefully difficult book to understand in the history of writing. Nietzsche purposely didn't want it to be decoded, and he said it would take about 200 years for people to figure out what he was talking about, and we're nearing in on the final decades of those 200 years. So one way of conceptualizing our third year backbone course is our first attempt to try to, we're going to push the bounds on comprehending what that's about, quite frankly. But, it's a really exciting book. However, it's like, wait a minute, this Jordan Peterson guy is super religious, and whatever people have heard about Nietzsche, they often hear that he was very atheistic. And, what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at William James and Pierce and Reid. We're gonna look at, pragmatists. We're gonna look at, existentialists. We're gonna look at Kierkegaard and Nietzsche almost together as twins in a sense, and we're going to look at Jung and we're going to look at Jordan Peterson. So the complementary courses to that backbone course of focusing on Nietzsche is to look at Jordan Peterson. And so what I wanted to do was share a quote here. So we'll look at a few of his different courses. Right now we're going through the psychological significance of the biblical stories, but I want to just share a quote from Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Long verily should we have to wait until someone reawoke thy God for thee. We actually do comprehend Nietzsche's Zarathustra better than I think anybody. Um, maybe we're in the top 5. There there's we're in the top 5 of people walking planet Earth who understand Nietzsche's Zarathustra by the time we're done with that course for sure. And there's a quote where Zarathustra's talking to the last in service, the one who was with God when he died. And Nietzsche is comprehending that he's understanding that this is an ongoing thing. There will be a reawakening. There will be a resurrection of the God that died. It will be in a new form, right? But this ongoing death and rebirth thing is true cosmically and in a divine level as well. And so he was describing the period that we were in, but Nietzsche said, the point of being a philosopher is to become timeless. So you should be outside your time and understand the greater context. So we'll put that aside for a moment, but I was considering reading that passage. Actually, you know what? Why don't we uh why don't we look at that real quickly? So Zarathustra has accomplished what he needed to accomplish in the third section of um of the book. There's four books and there's like four sections to the book, and then there's this preface that comes at the beginning. And, now that part 3 is over and he's actually accomplished it instead of just teaching things, he according to the model, right? We can reserve our judgment for whether or not it's accomplished, but the way he sees the problem and sets it up and what needs to be done to accomplish it, there are these higher men, and these higher men come up to Zarathustra's cave because the waves of nihilism are rising. um, I'm giving a little bit of interpretation to it, but the waters are rising, and to seek refuge, there are these different people who are crying in distress on his mountain, or at least Zarathustra hears a cry of distress and is trying to figure out where it's coming from. And while he's trying to figure out where it's coming from, he comes across this character called the last of service or the out of service. And you know what? I think I will change my mind. We won't read this right now. It's a really fantastic passage, but it's going to be an hour and a half long discussion. So, in it, he's talking to the last pope and he's discussing his views of the old God and why he needed to die. And the pope's response is to say, "Oh my gosh, Zarathustra, it is thy piety that makes thee ungodly." In other words, it's your respect for the truly divine that makes you say we've gotten things wrong. So there's a lot of irony and subtlety there, and it will be worth looking at some point. But we will have looked at it by the time we're done with the backbone course. So let's, without any further ado, um, just get into this, and Elena will be joining us soon.
Right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. I want to show you something here, just briefly. We'll go back to it later. Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse. Okay? Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyper.
We're having a tech issue. Let me just make sure I've turned off anything that might slow us down here.
It's the first hyperlink document. I remember that image well.
Yeah, that's a heck of an image right there. We could pause on that for a quick second and just be like, all right, so the length of the white line is how many times that verse is connected to or referenced by another verse. They all, I can't zoom in here to really examine this, but then these are all of those links and connections. That's
linked book.
That's a heck of a
right.
picture
I'm
right
dead
there.
serious about that. Like you can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book, and it's because, well, the people who worked on these stories that are hypothetically at the end, right, which is the end can't affect the beginning. That's the rule of time, right? What happens now can't affect what happened to you 10 years ago, even though it actually can, but whatever. Well, you reinterpret things, right? And then they're not the same, but whatever. We won't get into that. But technically speaking, the present cannot affect the past. But if we're looking at a piece of literature, that's not right, because when you write the end, you know what was at the beginning. And when you write the beginning or edit it, you know what's at the end. And so you can weave the whole thing together. And there's 65,000 cross references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never ever get to the end of it. There's permutations and combinations, and every phrase is dependent on every other phrase, and every verse is dependent on every other, not entirely, but 65,000 is not a bad start. And so, okay, well, that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're
Okay, we are receiving some real technical issues that we've never had before on this. I'm plugged into the Ethernet. Give me a second to try to figure out why. There's nothing else open here. Is it skipping even more on the video? Because I'm hearing the video directly, so it might be even worse on your side of things. But it is buffering a lot. So let's see if we can figure this out. I wonder what would happen if I move it to this screen here. And I say, get rid of the other screen. It's too much. Stumbling around here, buddy. Why don't you go sit down? Oh boy. See if we can make this work here. Okay, let's try that.
Constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus, and that's okay. But it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person and why not lie? You know, even a 3-year-old can ask that question because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something. It's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, you know, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, so look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today.
So Savad, for our other side studies, this, right? So he's going to he's brought up postmodernism earlier in this lecture, and he said this is a real problem. They've identified the problem correctly. Now, what he's outlining here is a very William Jamesian and pragmatic approach to solving the problem, right? So it's not, there's a problem with our understanding of the word pragmatic, because we think it means, well, forget about the truth. Let's just see what works. That's, of course, not what the pragmatists are doing. What they're saying is, look, yeah, you can interpret this text a billion different ways, right? But we can judge the outcomes of the ways that you're interpreting it. We can see, is it serving life? Is it helping you to get to your conceived aims, right? Like we can say, even though you could interpret it a billion. I remember a literature professor. I think he was the head of a literature department in the collapsing scenery of academia about 6 years ago or so. And this gentleman had a really awesome job. His job was to introduce students to great works of art and to read them and to discuss them. And what he decided to do with that privileged position was to argue with everybody to prove the point that there is no way to read a book, that books are meaningless. And the argument goes something like this: if a person writes a book in French and then it gets translated into English and you read the English version of the novel, there's all sorts of subtle connotations of the uses of all of the words that are unique to that French person and the way that they grew up and the way the language was being used. You can't just translate. And of course, this is true. Translators have to get you the meaning and the feel of the poetry and the poetic aspect of the novel and all of that stuff. Translators talk about this. There's a whole bunch of literature about what the art of translating is. It isn't just saying this word equals this word or something like that. But no matter how good the translation is, what he's saying is you don't know that specific author's experience with the word, right? Whatever word he's using, it's been used a certain number of times in his life and by him a certain number of times and to him a certain number of times in very specific contexts. And that will be unique compared to the way that every other French person experienced that word. And so not only can't you ever understand a novel that's been translated, but you can't understand a novel that's been translated from English to English, right? The way it was written in English and the way you hear it in English is different. So this is basically the postmodern trap, where they say, look, there's a combinatorial power behind all of this, and you can apply it not only to literature but to the facts in the world, right? That's what Peterson's outlining. He's saying, look, oh hey Elena, welcome. Let's do that. Okay, so so he says they've identified a problem and they're not wrong in their identification of the problem. But the William Jamesian and with the heritage with Pearson, James have one attempt to answer this problem. And I think the heritage comes from Reed with his common sense view, where he's not just saying, hey, if it's common sense, it's true. No, he's trying to pin down common sense and say that it underpins our notions, because nature wrote it into us, so to speak, right? And so what he's going to do here is he's going to say, okay, look, you can interpret King Lear a billion trillion different ways. But if the way that you interpret it causes you to jump off a bridge, well, your interpretation wasn't good enough, right? We could argue about whether or not that was the point of King Lear, but it's probably not, in a sense, right? So what we're saying is we don't have a science at the beginning that would allow us to say for sure if we implement this method, we will get the accurate and correct meaning of the text. The postmodernists win. There's no way of doing that. However, there's a reverse engineering way of doing it. And so that's what he's going to be
Also, not
talking about here.
tomorrow, and not next week, and not next month, and not next.
Your interpretation of the world is like a map of the world. And if it aims you in the wrong direction, or if it aims you in the right direction or close to the right direction, but orients you so that you try to advance towards that goal on a path that has pits, and you fall and you don't make it, by your own standard of what the purpose of the map was to begin with, we can use all of that subjective, again, not in a pejorative sense, but we can use all of that characterological, speaking to people as if they're entities with an aim language, to then go back and judge the objective interpretation and judge amongst the many different possible interpretations of not only a work of literature, but of all the facts that could be available to us. So I'm going to shut up now, and uh, just wanted to highlight that's what he's talking about here, and that's why it's interesting.
Next year. So, however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So, you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so, you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. He says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy. That's so ridiculously comical, But okay, but you see, we have to grapple with that. And so the you that's out there in the future is sort of like another person. And so figuring out how to conduct yourself properly in relationship to your future self isn't much different than figuring out how to conduct yourself in relationship to other people. But then we could expand the constraints. Not only does the interpretation that you extract have to protect you from suffering and give you an aim, but it has to do it in a way that's iterable, so it works across time, and then it has to work in the presence of other people so that you can cooperate with them and compete with them in a way that doesn't make you suffer more. And people they're not that tolerant. They have choices. They don't have to hang around with you. They can hang around with any one of these other primates. And so if you don't act properly, at least within certain boundaries, it's like you're just cast aside. And so people are broadcasting information at you all the time about how you need to interpret the world so they can tolerate being around you. And you need that because socially isolated, you're insane and then you're dead. No one can tolerate being alone for any length of time. We can't maintain our own sanity without continual feedback from other people because it's too damn complicated. So you're constrained by your own existence, and then you're constrained by the existence of other people. And then you're also constrained by the world. If I read Hamlet and what I extract out of that is the idea that I should jump off a bridge, it's like it puts my interpretation to an end rather quickly. It doesn't seem to be optimally functional, let's say. And so an interpretation is constrained by the reality of the world, it's constrained by the reality of other people, and it's constrained by your reality across time. And there's only a small number of interpretations that are going to work in that tightly defined space. And so that's part of the reason that the postmodernists are wrong. It's also part of the reason, by the way, that AI people who've been trying to make intelligent machines have had to put them in a body. Because it turns out that you just can't make something intelligent in some sense without it being embodied. And it's partly for the reasons that I just described, is you need constraints on the system so that the system doesn't drown in an infinite sea of interpretation. It's something like that. So that's the literary end of it. Moral. Well, morality for me is about action. And I'm an existentialist in some sense. And what that means is that I believe that what people believe to be true is what they act out, not what they say. And so there's lots of definitions of truth. Truth is a very expansive word, and you can think of objective truth. But behavioral truth isn't the same as objective truth. What you should do isn't the same as what is. As far as I can tell, people debate that. But I think the reason that has to be the case is because, think about it this way. You're standing in front of a field, and you can see the field. But the field doesn't tell you how to walk through it. There's an infinite number of ways you could walk through it. And so you can't extract out an inviolable guide to how you should act from the array of facts that are in front of you. Because there's just too many facts. And they don't have directionality. But you need to know. You need to know how not to suffer. And you need to know what your aim is. And so you have to overlay that objective reality with some interpretive structure. And it's the nature of that interpretive structure that we're going to be aiming at hard. I've given you some hints about it already. We've extracted it in part from observations of our own behavior and other people's behavior. And we've extracted it in part by the nature of our embodiment that's been shaped over hundreds of millions of years. But we see the infinite plane of facts and we impose a moral interpretation on it. And the moral interpretation is what to do about what is. And
So what's emerging here, what's so interesting is the exact reverse attitude towards the subjectivists, right? There's one of the features of Nietzsche's prophecy of the rise of nihilism is that if everything is meaningless, or if there's too many billions of potential meanings, and so they all equate to nothing, they're like all infinitesimally small, and none of them are graspable enough to sustain into matter, is a disorientation, right? And how many times have you noticed just in regular conversations about anything, let's say on Twitter, or just any conversation about anything, how quickly someone is eager to bring up the idea that something is subjective. Well, that's sort of how it seems to you, is sort of what that means. And so it's like that's disqualifying, right? So when we did our determinism versus free will thing in the very beginning of the year one section, we were looking at these determinists, and then we had William James show up, and William James showed up, and it's as if he felt he had a right to not value that post-Cartesian scientism language as if it's the ultimate truth, right? And this is why Nietzsche said that Christianity killed God. It's one of the reasons why, is that Christianity had invented this scientific perspective of being outside the universe, objectifying it, having it as an object on your workbench that you can make measurements of. And that perspective became in our imaginations the highest type of truth that anybody could have, right? And ultimately, if that's the highest type of truth, you discover that God isn't true in that way. Now, that's a hard thing for religious people to hear in our day, because they do think that that's the highest kind of truth, that nothing could be more true than something like that. And so they don't want to hear somebody say, oh, yeah, God's dead, right? That's what Nietzsche is putting it that way, because he's saying, look, that doesn't work. It's our actual way of conceptualizing the world itself from the very first word go that isn't working anymore. And so everything's dead. That's nihilism, right? Everything is going to come to nothing. It wasn't just God, it was everything. But um this pragmatic approach, or the existentialist approach, I mean, Nietzsche had this in his Zarathustra. There's a characterological embodiment of a way of being. There's a personality in Zarathustra which has to do things after two sections of talking, actually has to go and start the project of doing the thing. Now, whether it succeeded or not is a different matter for us to consider at another time. But the idea is that, okay, um, maybe what we need to do is just invert this idea that objective truth, which of course you're not going to get to because it's an infinite plane, as he said, an infinite plane of facts, and there's no canonical way of interpreting it. Instead, they say, well, wait a minute, we are in the universe. We're bringing something to it. The color of the grass exists partly because of the spectrum generating capacity of my character. The qualia of experience there isn't something objectively measurable. And there's all sorts of very foundational and significant aspects of being that simply require that I be a part of the cosmos. And that doesn't have the exact same feel of, oh no, it had to all be true, if even if I didn't exist. It had to all be true even if consciousness wasn't a part of the picture. It's like, well, wait a minute. You do exist in the universe. You are a part of whatever this whole thing is, and you're bringing so it's not an illegitimate move from this perspective to say, well, I put an overlay of value on this thing. There are aims that I could have that would lead to death and destruction. There are aims that I could have that could be higher. There are aims that I could have, perhaps I could participate in the highest aim possible. And if I'm doing that, what I can bring to being, if I'm careful about how I do that, this is why the figures of Marduk with the eyes around his head, Apollo with the sure shafts, and the willingness to stare at the things that need to be stared at. Um, these heroes are personalities, not accidentally because that's a way of encoding an objective or propositional truth, but because the ultimate kind of truth would be a way of being in the world. And so for the existentialists, they don't see a problem with just inverting that value judgment of what kind of truth are we after. And if you don't invert it, and you look at a personality like Christ saying, I am the truth, it's hard to even understand what the hell that could possibly mean. If what you're looking for is the objective descriptive truth apart from all brains, and it doesn't matter who we are, it just, if you wrote it, it would happen to be true kind of thing, that we're looking for if we're valuing that objectivist approach, or even a propositional approach that's not rooted in personality. The phrase "I am the truth" doesn't make any sense. But if you do invert, if you go, we're in this scientism age, but if you invert that scientism age valuation, suddenly you can have characters that are fundamentally important for the truth. The way you live is truthfully. I will be true, my darling. Like, the arrow flies straight and true. There's a kind of truth that could be much deeper and much more profound than just a statement that if I affirm it and have good reasons for affirming it, technically I win the philosophical analytical prize of having gotten the truth or something like that. So I just wanted to do that brief. I'm trying today to do more of something that I didn't do before, and we probably won't do too much of it. But just to put this in the context of those philosophical things that we are led through wrestling, um, in the other material, uh, just to relate it to that. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now.
And that's associated both with security, because you just don't need too much complexity, and also with aim. And so we're mobile creatures, right? We need to know where we're going, because all we're ever concerned about, roughly speaking, is where we're going. That's what we need to know. Where are we going? What are we doing and why? And that's not the same question as what is the world made of objectively. It's a different question, it requires different answers. And so that's the domain of the moral as far as I'm concerned, which is, what are you aiming at? And that's the question of the ultimate ideal in some sense. Even if you have trivial little, fragmentary ideals, there's something trying to emerge out of that that's more coherent and more integrated and more applicable and more practical. And that's the other thing, is that, you think about literature and you think about art and you think those aren't very tightly tied to the earth. They're Empyrean and airy and spiritual, and they don't seem practical, but I'm a practical person. And part of the reason that I want to assess these books from a literary and aesthetic and evolutionary perspective is to extract out something of value, something of real value that's practical. Something, because one of the rules that I have when I'm lecturing is that I don't want to tell anybody anything that they can't use, because I think of knowledge as a tool. It's something to implement in the world. We're tool-using creatures, and our knowledge is tools. And we need tools to work in the world. We need tools to regulate our emotions and to make things better and to put an end to suffering to the degree that we can, and to live with ourselves properly and to stand up properly. And you need the tools to do that. And so I don't want to do anything in this lecture series that isn't practical. I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately apply, not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction. Rational, well, it's got to make sense, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can get, than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution. So, and then finally, it's phenomenological. Modern people, we think of reality as objective, and that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience. And this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real. And so they're interested in the structure of your subjective experience. And you say, well, you have subjective experience and you have subjective experience, and so do you. And there's commonalities across all of those. Like, for example, you're likely to experience the same set of emotions. You know, we've been able to identify canonical emotions and canonical motivations. And without that, we couldn't even communicate because you wouldn't know what the other person was like. You'd have to explain infinitely. There's nothing you could take for granted, but you can. You know, and phenomenology is the fact that in the center of my vision, my hands are very clear, and then out in the periphery, they disappear. And phenomenology is the way things smell and the way things taste and the fact that they matter. And so you could say, in some sense, that phenomenology is the study of what matters rather than matter. And it's a given from the phenomenological perspective that things have meaning. That and you know, even if you're a rationalist, say, and a cynic and a nihilist, and you say, well, nothing has any meaning, you still run into the problem of pain, because pain undercuts your arguments and has a meaning. So there's no escaping from the meaning. You can pretty much demolish all the positive parts of it, but trying to think your way out of the negative parts, man, good luck with that, because that just doesn't work. So phenomenology is, and the Bible stories, and I think this is true of fiction in general, is phenomenological. And it concentrates on trying to elucidate the nature of human experience, and that is not the same as the objective world. But it's also a form of truth, because it is truth that you have a field of experience and that it has qualities. The question is,
One of the things we'll discuss in the after conversation when we end the recording is what Elena brought up in our other class the other day. Elena, right? So this phenomenology approach, it's like, I don't want to talk about the thing out there. I don't have access to it. What I want to talk about is the quality of the experience of the thing, and I'm going to call that real. That's shockingly opposite and the same as what you were pointing out with David Hume, isn't it? So let's discuss that after we're done with the recording part.
what are the qualities? Now,
I want to know what you think
ancient
about that.
representations of reality were sort of a weird meld of observable phenomena, things that we would consider objective facts, and subjective truth, the projection of subjective truth. And I'll show you, for example, I'll show you how the Mesopotamians viewed the world. They had a model. Basically, the world was a disc. You know, if you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of.
Okay, let's talk about this really quickly. And I'm going to say some stuff that's not exactly what he's going to say later. I was instead of prefacing. So there's a really awesome book that people should grab. If you're interested, if you're highly interested in what Peterson's about to say when you're listening to it, there's a really awesome book to grab, and it's called The Discarded Image. It's a book that was cobbled together, put together, constructed out of lectures, I believe, that C.S. Lewis was giving at Oxford at one point. And what he's doing is he's talking about and lecturing on the medieval view of cosmology. Now, the first chapter is the most important part for what we're going to discuss here. It's probably all we'll talk about right now, which is C.S. Lewis, who, by the way, while he's talking about how he thinks medieval people conceptualize the cosmos, in order to make some of his claims, he'll say, well, you know, they thought about it this way. Well, how do you know that? Well, here's some weird arcane poem that was popular in the 1200s that nobody has read since then that I happen to have read, that clearly the poetic meaning of it wouldn't make sense unless you were conceptualizing it this way. I mean, he's absolutely genius. And so that's he'll just off the top of his head go, well, like for instance, the line in this poem. It's like, line in what poem? Who the hell has talked about that poem in forever? It's really, really a cool lecture and a cool book. But the point that he makes at the beginning is really important, which is this: we know that medieval Europeans did obviously they didn't think the Earth was flat. They knew it was round. They knew it was a sphere. They had stories of descending into hell and then leaving out the other side and looking back, and the devil's upside down now, but you're still walking out. I mean, they understood that it was physically and objectively a sphere. And yet they had this view of the cosmos that was different than that. And so it's like, wait a minute, you've got you've got a physical understanding of the objective truth of the universe, and yet you're still debating, talking, and developing this other view of the universe. What the hell are you up to? What are these people up to? And for C.S. Lewis, it was the subject of cosmology is a subject aimed at discussing who we are in relationship with the cosmos. And that's different than, or that can often lead you to extremely different answers. Its aim is different than the aim of trying to get the objective description and the predictive formulas down correctly. And you can do both at the same time without seeing a contradiction. Okay. So it doesn't mean that you have to be scientifically ignorant to also engage in asking the questions, who am I in relationship to the cosmos? And if the question that you're asking, who am I as a personality in relationship to the cosmos, you might say, well, I live on a disk. I can look in all directions, and there's a limit to how far I can look, but I can walk this way, this way, this way, this way. I can move like that. But there's the idea that it's a sphere is really not relevant to me as a person. And again, a person can say that and completely comprehend that it's a sphere. The world, so let's be flat earthist for a moment and say the world is a sphere when you're programming a satellite GPS system. The world might be a sphere if you're piloting a transcontinental plane. Even if you're a pilot or a programmer of satellites, the world is not spherical the rest of the time you're thinking about it. You just ignore that fact because whenever anybody brings up the question of the shape of the earth, you immediately jump to, oh yeah, I'm supposed to say it's a sphere. But that's not how you're conceptualizing it. And the idea that there would be a legitimate humanities subject of interest to say, who are we in relationship to the cosmos? And that the people who do that in many different, the Mesopotamians are doing it, the medievals are getting to the same conclusion, that the people who are seriously thinking those questions, which are different and not in contradiction to and can be understood by the same brains that also understand the objective perspectives, the story they get is, okay, I'm on a disc, it's supported on something. There are domes above it of different realms of authority or things that are distant from me that might have effect on my life, but whatever. We don't have to get into the further chapters of it. But if you're interested in a modern, C.S. Lewis at Oxford giving a lecture on, hey, there's a lot of value in thinking about the world this way. Let me help explain to you how it works and how that conversation goes, and maybe come to realize that there's almost a dead subject or a subject that's been hijacked by others. Or I mean, so if you look at cosmologists and astrophysicists, they'll talk about the objective description of stars, but then they'll also, and the reason why they're so interesting is that they'll often step over into this other field and say, well, you are stardust or you are on an insignificant speck in the cosmos. Well, ob those are taking the objective reality, but then moving over into this realm of telling you who you are as a personality, who you are in significance. And that is a different subject. And it used to be that we had both subjects and that we could understand that they were two different subjects. So that's, I think, a worthwhile aside. And if anybody's more interested in that, we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about it. But C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image is a really, really fantastic book on that.
Of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously, it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from?
Sorry, I interrupted it in an inconvenient spot.
It's
Let's
got
go
a
back.
dome on top. At night, they had a model. Basically,
here we
the
go.
world was a disc. If you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously, it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from? Well, there's water around the dome. And then there's land, that's the disc, and then underneath that there's water. How do you know that? Well, drill. You'll hit water. What's under the earth, obviously, because otherwise, how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? This fresh.
Shoot, I hold on a second. My bad.
Because otherwise, how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? This fresh water. And then what's under that? Well, if you go to the edge of the disc, you hit the ocean. It's salt water. So it's a dome with water outside of it, and then it's a disc that the dome sits on, and then underneath that there's fresh water, and then underneath that there's salt water. And that was roughly the Mesopotamian world. And you see that's a mix of observation and imagination, right? Because that isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. It's a perfectly believable cosmology and the sun rises and the sun sets on that dome. It's not like the thing is bloody well spinning. Who would ever think that up? It's obviously the sun comes up and goes down and then travels underneath the world and comes back up again. There's nothing more self-evident than that. Well, that's that strange intermingling of subjective fantasy, let's say, right at the level of perception and actual observable phenomena. And a lot of the cosmology that's associated with the biblical stories is exactly like that. It's half psychology and half reality, although the psychological is real as well. So that, and to know that the biblical stories have a
Okay, a quick side note, and then we're going to focus on this phenomenology thing that he's emphasizing and talking about here. Um, so I think that distinction we brought up here between two different ways of trying to approach the world and understand it, and that both can be useful and neither has to be in contradiction, and maybe saying, well, putting the right one as supreme or understanding the relationship between them and which one's deeper or whatever might be a key to the mistake that we're making. Again, that's in the conception of Nietzsche and in this tradition. Um, okay, Wittgenstein had a conversation about relativity, right? So famously, he meets a colleague in I don't remember who it was. He meets a colleague, and he says, Why is it that people used to think that the sun rose and the sun set rather than that the Earth spun round?" And the friend said to him, he said, "Well, obviously because it looks that way. It just looks like that. Uh, so that's why they made that mistake, quote unquote, if it's a mistake, right? Because it's a mistake from the objectivist descriptive perspective." And then Wittgenstein's response was, "What would it have looked like if it had looked like the Earth was spinning?" Right? And then all of a sudden you start to realize what's going on here, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. If it had looked like the Earth was spinning, it would have looked exactly the way it does look. So what do you mean it looked like the sun was going around the Earth? And Nietzsche had this phrase we're going to discuss. We just on Thursday started our philosophy of mind, and we're going to read an essay called What It's Like to Be a Bat at some point. Well, Nietzsche once answered the question, what's it like to be a flea? He said, I'll tell you what it's like to be a flea. He said, it's just like being the center of the universe. Now, from a scientism objectivist, where you're valuing the objective truth as higher and as the only maybe legitimate realm for having truth in the first place, if that's the view you have, you read those two stories or those two ideas and you say, oh, look at us, we're lost and we're deceived and we have no idea what's going on. But I believe I heard this, and maybe it's scientifically not accurate, but I've heard this, and I'll have to look it up, that the number of neuron connections in your brain outnumbers the stars. I think by orders of magnitude. And so the question is, how insignificant is the perspective of a creature looking out at the world with aims and desires and goals and right and wrong ways to travel? How illegitimate is that if it seems illegitimate because look at how far apart the stars are? This other perspective might say, look at how expansive space has to be just to compete with us. Right? We're conceptualizing the stars, we're measuring the stars, we're living in a world that's this big outside of our brains. So one way to look at it is to take the perspective, the fictionally based perspective of being outside that universe and looking for us and saying, "Wow, you're so tiny, I can't even see you." That's one perspective. But this phenomenologist attitude, it has the opposite instinct that says, "Now hold on a second here. Um, Whatever's going on up here is able to comprehend all of that. Maybe you need to be that old and that expansive just to compete with the capacity of a creature in the world." Um, it's a value judgment idea, right? So that's not claiming an objective truth. That's saying, okay, so now objectively, scientifically, I found the units of significance and where they're located. It's not pretending to be something like that. What it's revealing is a bias of perspective that's based, I think, in this turning over the value judgment system of valuing the objectivist approach as necessarily supreme and higher. And it's saying, well, that you're doing that not because of something in your microscope or telescope. You're doing that because it's an expression of your personal inclinations, perhaps, or maybe it's an assumption that's reasonable that you might make when you first discover how big the universe is. But just because it's reasonable to imagine that people would think that way the first time they learn it, what if we could synthesize it? What if we could swallow whole all of these scientific facts and then come with a different value judgment, since what you're expressing is a value judgment, even though you didn't know it? And you thought you were just telling me factually how insignificant we are or how small we are in relation to other things. I'll quickly wrap up, but I'm reminded of a story that Voltaire wrote called Micromegas. It's probably one of the best short stories with one of the lamest titles ever. But it's we'll look at it at some point. It's a story called Micromegas that's about a giant from another planet, so giant that he needs a microscope to see us, and he travels the cosmos to try to learn things. And what he learns is that everywhere in proportion, size doesn't matter. There are creatures with rationality and moral significance that are so big they dwarf him into nothing, and so small that he can barely see them. And anyway, it's a very interesting short story, but let's move on.
Phenomenological truth is really worth knowing because
All right, so let's get to him tying in why he talked about Nietzsche, he talked about Jung, he talked about the postmodern problem, he talked about the hyperlinked text of these scriptures. He's priming us to understand how he's going to be approaching the stories, and now he's going to give us a summation of this phenomenological perspective that he's taking.
the poor fundamentalists, they're trying to cling to their moral structure. And, I understand why. Because it does organize their societies and it organizes their psyche. So they've got something to cling to. But, they don't have a very sophisticated idea of the complexity of what constitutes truth. And they try to gerrymander the biblical stories into the domain of scientific theory, promoting creationism, for example, as an alternative scientific theory. It's like that just isn't going to go anywhere, because the people who wrote these damn stories weren't scientists to begin with. There weren't any scientists back then. There's hardly any scientists now. It's hard to think scientifically, man. It's like it takes a lot of training, and even scientists don't think scientifically once you get them out of the lab, and hardly even when they're in the lab. You got to get peer reviewed and criticized, and it's hard to think scientifically. So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought. But that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth. And that's okay, There are truths to live by. Okay, well, fine. Then we want to figure out what those are because we need to live and maybe not to suffer so much. So if you know that what the Bible stories and stories in general are trying to represent is the lived experience of conscious individuals, like the structure of the lived experience of conscious individuals, then that opens up the possibility of a whole different realm of understanding and eliminates the contradiction that's been painful for people between the objective world and let's say the claims of religious stories. So, okay, so let's take a look at the structure of the book itself. So the first thing about the Bible is that it's a comedy, and a comedy has a happy ending, right? So that's a strange thing because the Greek God stories were almost always tragic. Now,
Okay, so there's a break there. We've done the preface. I'm going to open it up to the vote. We can either go to our after conversation for half an hour, or we can do what we've been doing here with the video for another half an hour. So I'm going to leave it open to the first person who says what they would prefer of those two here.
Are we going to talk about his last statement there about comedies and tragedies, or no?
Yeah, we can do that. We can just so we can do that here and keep watching the video because he's just introduced this idea. So, Ray, a
Yeah, could you
comedy
get
has
through
a
that?
happy ending. I'm sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, I'd like to get through that
Okay, good. I agree. This is really
point.
interesting. Okay, good. Let's keep watching.
The Bible is a comedy. It has a happy ending. Everyone lives. There's a heaven. So now, what you think about that is a completely different issue. I'm just telling you the structure of the story. It's something like there was paradise at the beginning of time, and then some cataclysm occurred and people fell into history, and history is limitation and mortality and suffering and self-consciousness. But there's a mode of being, or potentially the establishment of a state, that will transcend that. And that's what time is aiming at. So that's the idea of the story. Now, it's a funny thing that the Bible has a story because it wasn't written as a book, right? It was assembled from a whole bunch of different books. And the fact that it got assembled into something resembling a story is quite remarkable. And what the question is then, well, what is that story about? And how did it come up as a story? And then I suppose as well, is there anything to it? It constitutes a dramatic record of self-realization or abstraction. We already mentioned that. It's like the idea, for example, of the formulation of the, let's say, the image of God is an abstraction. That's how we're going to handle it to begin with. I want to say, though, because I said I wasn't going to be any more reductionist than necessary, I know that the evidence for genuine religious experience is incontrovertible, but it's not explicable. And so I don't want to explain it away. I want to just leave it as a fact. And then I want to pull back from that and say, okay, well, we'll leave that as a fact and the mystery, but we'll look at this, we're going to look at this from a rational perspective and say that the initial formulation of the idea of God was an attempt to abstract out the ideal and to consider it as an abstraction outside its instantiation. So, and that's good enough. That's amazing. That's an amazing thing if it's true. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. It's a collection of books with multiple redactors and editors. So what does that mean? Many people wrote it. There's many different books, and they're interwoven together, especially in the first 5 books, by people who, I suspect, took the traditions of tribes that had been brought together under a single political organization and tried to make their accounts coherent. And so they took a little of this, and they took a little of that, and they took a little of this, and they tried not to lose anything because it seemed valuable, or it was certainly valuable to the people who had collected the stories. They weren't going to, tolerate too much editing, but they also wanted it to make sense to some degree, so it wasn't completely logically contradictory and completely absurd. And so many people wrote it, and many people edited it, and many people assembled it over a vast stretch of time. And we have very few documents like that. And so just because we have a document like that is sufficient reason to look at it as a remarkable phenomena and try to understand what it is that it's trying to communicate, let's say. And then I said it's also the world's first hyperlinked text, which is that again, and very much worth thinking about for quite a long time. All right, there's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly. There's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. So, and that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first. And well, it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. And it it has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when, and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in the form, just the form of the Ten Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of the.
Okay. So typically we'll do about an hour and a half. There's exactly 1 hour left, and so what I'm going to do is actually say I would like to talk about the historical compilation of the Bible. Not much more than he does, but let's do this. We're going to finish this first video in our next class get together. So let's end it here. Although it's really really interesting, we're gonna. Oh, actually, you know what? He does a Q&A. Maybe we can let him continue. Uh, I just he does a Q&A around. It's hard to know where. One moment. I think the technology will not tell us. Q&A starts at 1:57. Okay, let's continue.
You know, that society is predicated, this was Israeli society, was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the Ten Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist Code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, you know, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, you know, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, you know, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but that's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like it's a collective story. And okay, now to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough, to something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea, this is what John said about Christ. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that Logos represents is something like modern people. It's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate. It's something like that. And there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything. It's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question. And the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that, too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it. I mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration. And the notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it. And the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being. And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question. But at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that. And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will, you know, that you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine. But the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something deep about it, because, you know, you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine. Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself. And you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that there's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. And you can debate that, but you know, it's not, you can't just bloody well brush it off. Because first of all, we are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, you know, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which, you know, really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing. You know, you can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, you know, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associating with the word that brings forth being, is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, you actually take that seriously. Well, what you got to ask is, What happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? That's read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced. Because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people. And that as a consequence, he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting, right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want, which is the psychopath's viewpoint? Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person, even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously. Now, you know, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right. And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas. And they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation. And Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself if you're not a criminal if you don't act it out. And then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? Is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril. And it also took people a very long time to figure out. This is Genesis 1. You know what, I'm probably going to stop there because I believe it's 9:30. And so we didn't even get to the first line. Yeah. Look, I want to read you a couple of things that we'll use as a prodroma for the next lecture, because I'll just bounce through a collection of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, there's an
I don't think anybody wants to stop, but we're going to keep this at the time limit that we said, and that's a good place to stop, because he's going to start talking about conceptions of the divine, which is really, I think he's going to end up spending most of the second lecture going through all of that stuff too. If I remember correctly, it's not until the third lecture that he actually gets into the first verse. But that stuff is worth thinking about, and it's really fun to talk about. So what we'll do is we'll end the stream now and have our after conversation about all of this and our discussion group. And then we'll see everybody else who's watching on live stream. We'll see you next week. And I suppose you can DM if you want to be a part of this, but let's go do the after talk.